Dear colleagues, please take your seats. Honorable delegates, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, we now begin the first session of this parliamentary conference entitled The OSCE's Conflict Cycle, Dialogue Facilitation, Conflict Resolution, Mediation Support, Conciliation and Post-Conflict Rehabilitation. This theme is not only at the heart of the OSCE's mandate, but it also resonates deeply in today's world, where conflict and instability continue to shape the lives of millions across our region and beyond. We gather here while the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine rages on, bringing untold suffering to the people of Ukraine and challenging the very foundations of international law and peace in Europe. In the South Caucasus, the occupation of the Abkhazia and Tsinghvali regions of Georgia remains unresolved. Just 1 year ago, we were meeting in Yerevan on the back of the exodus of more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians from the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan, a painful reminder that unresolved tensions can lead to devastating humanitarian consequences. The situation in Moldova remains another ongoing concern, where a frozen conflict presents persistent challenges to the country's stability and territorial integrity. But as we reflect on these active and unsolved conflicts, it is important to also acknowledge the positive impact that sustained international engagement we can have. For over 2 decades, the Western Balkans have experienced peace, and much of this stability is thanks to the OSCE's field operations and our collective commitment to building peace through dialogue, reconciliation, and institution building. 3 decades after being ripped apart with bloody wars, this region serves as a testament to what can be achieved when the international community remains steadfast in its pursuit of peace. Democratization, inclusive governments, transparency, and the rule of law has promoted long-term stability. Creating more resilient societies has made these countries capable of resolving international conflicts peacefully. Throughout the OSCE area, the establishment of democratic norms has proven instrumental in reducing tensions, preventing the resurgence of violence, and strengthening our overall security architecture. Regrettably, conflict is not limited to our region alone. The Middle East remains a significant source of instability, with the ongoing military operations in Gaza, escalating tensions in the West Bank, and growing hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah. These issues are compounded by Iran's destabilizing influence across the region and the Houthi attacks on international shipping routes, which threaten global security and economic stability. Though these conflicts may seem distant, they are deeply intertwined with wider security challenges, including the global refugee crisis and the persistent fight against terrorism and violent extremism. Their ripple effects are felt far beyond the region, underscoring the need for concerted international efforts to address these interconnected threats. They remind us that peace requires constant effort, vigilance, and a willingness to engage in dialogue, no matter how complex the situation. It is against this backdrop that the OSCE's work across the entire conflict cycle, from early warning to post-conflict rehabilitation, remains indispensable. A few weeks ago, the Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen presented to the OSCE Permanent Council Finland's priorities as the incoming OSCE Chair in Office for 2025. Minister Valtonen emphasized the work of the OSCE in preventing, managing and addressing conflicts and crises, highlighting the need to make full use of OSCE experience and expertise, in particular in mediation and dialogue facilitation. The need for strong international mechanisms for dialogue, mediation and reconciliation has never been more urgent. The speakers joining us today bring with them a wealth of knowledge and experience that will greatly enrich our discussions. It is therefore my great honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. His Excellency Bertie Ahern, former Prime Minister of Ireland between 1997 and 2008, who has played an instrumental role in conflict resolution, particularly through the Northern Ireland peace process. Joining us remotely, Mr. Sean Decalou, Deputy Director for Operations Service in the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center, who is a current officer in charge of the Conflict Prevention Center, and Dr. Arturo Kartsonaki, Senior Researcher at the Center for OSCE Research, Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in the University of Hamburg, whose academic area of expertise broadly covers complexities of conflict and peace building. I look forward to the insights they will share, and I encourage all of us to engage thoughtfully in what promises to be a vital discussion on the OSCE's role in fostering peace and security. Thank you. It is now my honor to introduce His Excellency Bertie Ahern, former Prime Minister of Ireland, whose leadership was instrumental in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, bringing peace after decades of conflict. Mr. Ahern's extensive experience in conflict resolution, dialogue facilitation and post-conflict rehabilitation offers valuable insights into the OSCE's work in managing conflict cycles. Your Excellency, we are looking forward to hearing your reflections about peace processes and your insights on trust building, international mediation, and sustaining peace in post-conflict regions. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Can I first of all welcome you all, Parliamentary Conference to Ireland, to Dublin, and to what was my old parliamentary constituency. So I do hope you have a pleasant time here along with the work. Also to your staff, who I had the pleasure of meeting earlier on in the year in Vienna. Thank them for their cooperation always. OSCE, after 30 years, you have done so much good work, and I know through very difficult times. Deputy Creed was just telling me about a meeting at the start of the Ukrainian conflict when you were all together, and when so much of the difficulties that have happened. But I'm not here to talk on that matter today. I'm going to keep my words to Northern Ireland. But I've long had the pleasure of being with and friendly with OSCE members. I've two permanent council meetings that I can recall where I had the opportunity of addressing them. I was also at the Istanbul summit some years ago when times were a little bit less difficult. And as a founding member, Ireland has played a key role since the time of the Helsinki summit, and I think we've always been actively participating in the affairs as the Irish delegation are today, and have always done so. The focus, I suppose, of so much of your meetings will be on Ukraine and the Middle East, and I know Friday you have the Assembly of the Mediterranean Forum will take place, so I wish all of those discussions well. I was asked to say a few words on Northern Ireland, President, so I suppose every conflict is complex and no two are alike, and there is no one-size-fits-all model for peace. However, there are, in my view, core elements and lessons to be drawn from Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreements that can be useful, not always, but in some parts of the world. The first and foremost, I think, lesson is simple, that a peace process can succeed. We have learned in Ireland that strong political institutional frameworks and safeguards, however imperfect, protect communities and ensure representation in a post-conflict context. International support is vital in securing and maintaining peace, and international figures can act as a neutral arbitrator on difficult issues such as decommissioning of arms and trying to bring difficult issues to the fore and find a resolution for them. But the process must be inclusive. The civil society has a huge role to play in building and sustaining peace. Civil society, women's groups, organisations, in particular in Northern Ireland, have been at the heart of reconciliation efforts and building cross-community dialogue and relationships which transcend old divides. And supporting and sustaining peace-building efforts, President, is a central element of Ireland's foreign policy, drawing on our lived experience and history. And because of this, it's also a key component of our international development policy and necessary for achieving the sustainable development goals. Peace is a process, of course. It's not an event. The Good Friday Agreement, signed in 1998 and took 10 years to implement, it brought to an end 30 years of violence and conflict on this island. But there's a constant challenge to protecting a hard-won peace. Promoting, sustaining peace requires a joined-up approach to sustainable development, humanitarian action and peace building. And support and financing for peace building should be comprehensive, it should be coordinated, and it should be part of a coherent humanitarian development peace nexus approach. We've witnessed firsthand the pivotal role women have played in Northern Ireland peace process, both in negotiating the political settlement and continuing the essential work of peace building today. Because peace agreements, and I have been lucky enough to be involved in negotiations in many countries, but we have seen that the agreements that are brokered with the full, equal and meaningful participation of women are not only better in terms of substance, but are also enduring. The Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition found their place at the table and they made it count. They brought a different approach and a perspective to the talks, acting as champions for the process itself rather than old, hard cases that followed from history. Their cross-community membership, their joint leadership, ensured a stronger focus on issues not defined by the traditional unionist nationalist divide. And they contributed to a focus on rights and socio-economic issues, which they continue working on to this day. In drawing precedent on the lessons of the peace process, Ireland strongly supports an inclusive approach to peace. This means supporting the engagement of women and civil society from the very beginning and throughout peace processes, in line with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Ireland has long been and continues to be an advocate for the inclusion of civil society, local peacemakers and a range of actors that have been traditionally excluded from peace processes around the world, in particular young people, minorities and, as I've said, women. We recognise the need to support locally owned and nationally led processes in line with the best practice and the localisation agenda. We also must ensure that our approaches are sufficiently flexible, adaptable, innovative to be able to respond to local needs and changing situations. Young people, President, also play a critical role in the prevention and the resolution of conflict and peace building. We in Ireland know that peace building is an intergenerational process and must be inclusive of the rising generation of young people. And we've seen great success through funding and building cross-community initiatives, such as youth forums, sports clubs, the arts in Northern Ireland, which can help break down decade-old divides between communities and build new relationships. And this lived experience is why we strongly support the Youth, Peace and Security agenda and know the benefits that it may bring. My last point, President, Ireland believes that inclusive transitional justice systems are critical for achieving a sustainable peace. We know from our experience that the implementation of transitional justice and peace agreements have the best chance of success when the international community supports the commitment and efforts of its participants, and the process of peace in Northern Ireland has endured through 30 years, in large part due to the partnership and support of the international community. I'm conscious that your conference and parliamentary gathering meets at a time where the escalating problems in the Middle East, the ongoing conflicts in so many other places, and of course Ukraine, which I know OSCE watch every hour of every day, is foremost in your minds. I always believe that if you keep trying, if you keep enduring, no matter how many setbacks, you do get there. In Ireland we had several over a long, long period, and in other conflicts it's never easy. You just have to keep at it. So, President, I wish you well and wish your conference well, and again, thank you for all being in Ireland.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Our next speaker will connect with us by remote participation. And it is my pleasure to introduce him, Mr. Sean de Calloway, who has taken on the crucial role of officer in charge of the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center since the appointment of Ms. Kate Fearon as the OSCE Acting Secretary General in the beginning of September. Mr. de Calloway is joining us remotely. Before joining OSCE, Mr. de Calloway served as the head of the Assistance and Protection Branch in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and has a vast military experience in the Canadian Armed Forces. Mr. de Calloway will share his insights on the OSCE's comprehensive approach to conflict management, covering early warning, conflict prevention, mediation and post-conflict rehabilitation, as well as the current challenges the organization faces in managing complex and evolving conflicts across the OSCE region. Mr. de Calloway, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you, even if remotely. Indeed, the gray and rainy weather that I have here makes me regret even more that I can't be with you in what I understand to be a sunny Dublin. Let me begin by thanking you, Madam President, and all the members of the PA for this opportunity to speak about the OSCE conflict cycle and our related tools and endeavors during this important session. Indeed, you mentioned the current officer in charge, Secretary General Kate Fearon, who sends her best regards and regrets that she also could not join you. Indeed, she was, as was just mentioned, part of the Irish experience as both a young person and a woman. So she would have been also well placed to speak on many of these topics, and I extend her regrets that she wasn't able to make it. Today, we face a complex and diverse set of interrelated security challenges in the OSCE area. We are confronted with a highly dynamic and volatile geopolitical environment, and we are a witness to developments that fundamentally impede our collective security. As has been mentioned, the war in Ukraine has challenged all of the OSCE's core principles and commitments, while the risk of conflict also remains in other parts of the OSCE area. In this context, multilateral engagement in preventative diplomacy by participating states has become increasingly difficult. To deal with such challenges, we need to flexibly consider the application of the OSCE tools to evolving security threats. But more importantly, we need the political will of participating states to make active use of the tools for conflict prevention and resolution that have been placed at our disposal by our predecessors. A wide array of tools and mechanisms have been agreed by participating states in the OSCE and have evolved over the course of more than 30 years. Indeed, the Finnish chair of the Structured Dialogue created an OSCE Toolbox app in 2023, which provides an easily accessible and useful overview of all the tools at our disposal, including who can use them, when, and how. Since the adoption of the Ministerial Council Decision 3/11 on the elements of the conflict cycle, We have invested considerable efforts in the Secretariat in further developing these tools to address the different phases of the conflict cycle. Among others, these efforts have focused on implementing a more systematic and structured approach to early warning, with the aim of facilitating preventative action or early response. As OSCE-wide early warning focal point, the Conflict Prevention Center has a pivotal role to play in providing early warning-related analysis to the Secretary General and to the Chair of the Permanent Council. To maintain situational awareness, our Conflict Prevention Center's Situation Room monitors developments via open sources around the clock, 365 days a year, throughout the OSCE region and beyond. The CPC is also responsible for coordinating an OSCE-wide network that brings together early warning focal points from all OSCE executive structures. This network is a key element for sharing information and expertise, including on other conflict cycle topics such as dialogue facilitation and mediation, crisis management, and peace building. Indeed, the Secretariat of the Parliamentary Assembly is represented in the network through its early warning focal point, Mr. Francesco Pagani. We are grateful for your presence in the network, which is crucial to ensuring the PA's capacities to address different phases of the conflict cycle are properly integrated into the OSCE's overall assessment of unfolding situations in the region. While situational awareness and early warning are needed to enable preventative or early responses to emerging crises, at times, not even our best efforts are enough to prevent escalation or recourse to non-peaceful means. Bridging the gap from early warning to early action remains a considerable challenge. At times, we lack the resources or mandate, but in many cases, it is a lack of political will amongst participating states to make use of the OSCE tools, instruments, and mechanisms. Many of these require consensus in the Permanent Council to be activated, and this lack of consensus is compounded by insufficient resources to fully implement Decision number 311. And the political commitment of participating states is crucially needed to properly fund the OSCE and to empower it to resolutely fulfill its role as the world's largest regional security organization. At the same time, we continue our work to enhance OSCE capacities for early action and crisis response. And to this end, the CPC recently established an OSCE Strategic Asset Reserve, a pool of assets to enable the rapid deployment of immediate responders to a crisis situation. The CPC also continues to conduct crisis simulation exercises with the incoming OSCE chairs, as with all OSCE field operations. We are also exploring ways to use emerging technologies to enhance situational awareness and conflict analysis through our recently launched OSCE-wide Geographic Information System pilot project, which will develop tailored geolocation-driven applications for the users in the executive structures. We also continue to make use of our tools to support the peaceful resolution of conflict through mediation and dialogue facilitation. Our mediation support team continues to strengthen capacities for peaceful conflict resolution, both on the ground and at the strategic level. At this time, when formal peace processes are under pressure, our MST mediation support team is working to strengthen the OSCE's engagement in facilitating dialogue amongst various actors. Indeed, the OSCE has a wealth of expertise and experience in facilitating dialogue across the conflict cycle, in particular within our field operations. A recent mapping of OSCE dialogue engagements in the field between 2020 and 2023 clearly shows that the OSCE's dialogue facilitation adds value. Our long-term sustained presence in the field and strong thematic expertise has made the OSCE a trusted partner, not only for government officials and civil society actors, but all members of society. The OSCE, thus, is empowered to serve as a convener of dialogue, connecting various actors to foster mutual understanding, which serves to build trust and ultimately greater social cohesion. Colleagues, the OSCE is uniquely positioned to foster community-level, regional, and state-to-state dialogue at different levels, be it in the field or amongst participating states in Vienna. The OSCE's mandate for conflict prevention and peaceful conflict resolution is based on local ownership and approaches that meet the needs of people on the ground. Building sustainable peace and security requires an approach that is broadly shared and supported by national parliaments and by local efforts. The establishment and promotion of local conflict resolution infrastructures are particularly useful in this regard. They can include national or local institutions involved in mediation and dispute resolution, community-based early warning networks, or conflict prevention and reconciliation initiatives. A key benefit of engaging local infrastructures is their ability to provide space and entry points to broaden the meaningful participation of various actors, such as civil society, women's peace initiatives, and youth. As we work on the further implementation of our toolkit for inclusion of women and effective peace processes, we would welcome any good practices and lessons learned that the Parliamentary Assembly can bring to our attention. More inclusive peace processes and dialogue efforts lead to more inclusive outcomes that better reflect the concerns of the broader society and thus strengthening the sustainability of the peace developed. While the daily engagement of our field operations is at the forefront of this work, the Parliamentary Assembly also actively contributes to these efforts by facilitating interparliamentary dialogue between our participating states. In recent years, the PA has invested considerable effort in enhancing its own capacities to implement and support mediation and dialogue facilitation, following your resolution on the development of mediation capacity in the OSCE area, adopted at your 2014 annual session, as well as the follow-up resolution in 2016. In 2016, we also note that the PA appointed a special representative on mediation that has since invested in furthering its mediation capacities of the PA. Our mediation support team stands ready to support this work upon request. The OSCE has a long history of supporting participating states and strengthening their security sector institutions, which is another important conflict prevention tool. While security sector governance and reform remain nationally owned, the CPC and field operations provide demand-driven support to these efforts, in line with the OSCE's comprehensive approach to security. This important work was recognized by the Parliamentary Assembly with the adoption of its resolution entitled Strengthening the OSCE's Approach to Supporting Security Sector Governance and Reform in Participating and Partner States at your 2018 Parliament annual session. Again, parliaments play a key role in ensuring that the security sector is subject to the same standards of good governance as any other public sector. Parliamentary oversight of the security sector is an essential tool to maintain accountability and transparency within the framework of democratic control. Promoting democratic oversight, very often in cooperation with the Parliamentary Assembly, is a key area of our Secretariat engagement in the field of SSGR. To further this work, the CPC, the Conflict Prevention Center, also coordinates the OSCE-wide network of SSGR focal points, where the PA is also represented. We also provide tailored support to the security sector governance and reform work in our field operations. Currently, the CPC is conducting a mapping study across the OSCE area to gain an overview of all of our SSGR work over the past decade and to provide a strategic outlook with recommendations for advancing further future engagement and leveraging our competitive and comparative advantages in this field. The study will facilitate the further development of an SSGR policy, capacity building, and operational engagement to better understand the security needs of societies in the OSCE region. In today's complex and fragile security environment, the OSCE's role as a regional arrangement contemplated by Chapter 8 of the Charter of the United Nations is more relevant than ever. To fully implement this mandate in all phases of the conflict cycle, the CPC needs adequate financial and human resources, as well as political support in its participating states. The Parliamentary Assembly can assist these efforts by ensuring informed consideration of these and other key OSCE issues in your respective capitals. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the OSCE possesses the tools to address today's security risks and challenges across the region. However, to do so, as I've said already, Our OSCE institutions need to be empowered by participating states, and participating states must support the full and effective use of all of our tools and mandates. Madam President, I thank you for the floor, and I thank you for the attention of your parliamentary colleagues.
Mr. De Caluwe, thank you. Our next speaker today is Dr. Argyro Kartsonaki, Senior Researcher at the Center of the OSCE Research at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Dr. Kartsonaki is also the co-editor of Ethnopolitics and OSCE Insights academic journals. Dr. Kartsonaki's academic expertise spans the complexities of conflict and peace building, with a particular focus on the role of international actors as well as in secession and war to peace transitions after civil wars. Dr. Kartsonaki, we would be glad to hear your views on OSCE's role in early warning, prevention, mediation, and post-conflict rehabilitation. How do you see the effective OSCE engagement in mediation and dialogue in secessionist conflicts and the potential role of parliamentarians in these efforts? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about the role of international actors in conflict resolution, then focus on dialogue facilitation in secessionist conflicts, and end with some recommendations for the OSCE community and the parliaments. So starting with the role of international actors in managing a conflict. Do international actors help ending a conflict? So the literature says yes, in most cases at least yes. So when asked, okay, then how? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on the context, the region, the nature of the conflict, the dynamics of the global level, at the global level. And then the question comes up of who is good to get involved and when. For the past 5 years, we have been researching the question of how do recurring wars end. And we investigated 11 countries that had experienced recurring wars, but managed to end the conflict in a negotiated settlement. So admittedly, our cases are outside the OSCE region, but we test our findings in a bigger data set with more cases, and we are confident that our findings hold more broadly and are also applicable to the OSCE context. So we found, sorry to the OSCE, that it's the UN leadership of the mediation process and continued involvement after the signing of the agreement that is instrumental in preventing civil war recurrence. And that is because of the UN's nearly universal membership and the way that mediators are selected, that creates a perception of legitimacy and impartiality. And the UN is also able to pool resources in the aftermath of conflict and help with peacekeeping and peace building in tangible means. But this means that it is the characteristics of the mediation that matter, and in particular, 3 important elements: legitimacy, impartiality, and resources. And I will return to these 3 points later in the OSCE context. And the beneficial impact of mediation is amplified when there are provisions in the peace agreements for the inclusion of women in post-conflict societies through a range of socio-economic measures aiming to empower women and women's civil society organizations. And this is the case because the synergy between external actors and women's networks help enhance ownership of the peace process. They create feedback loops that enable early warning and provide the resources for action to mitigate and address emerging problems. And moving on to dialogue facilitation in secessionist conflicts. We have also found that mechanisms for dialogue have a fundamental role in achieving negotiated ends in recurring civil wars. And one of the OSCE tools is dialogue facilitation at different levels. And this is of utmost importance for all phases of the conflict cycle. There is a strong need for multi-level dialogue at the different stages of the conflict cycle, and different forms of dialogue depending on the stage and the context. And here is where the OSCE field operations come in. That's because field operations are the eyes and the ears of the organization on the ground. Through the field operations, the OSCE engages with locals, both as staff working in the operations and through the various projects that they run. And it is very important to focus on the youth in this context of dialogue in secessionist conflicts, but actually any conflict. Youth discontents, disappointments, lack of opportunities, lack of hope for the future, and how the youth react to all this are very important warnings, because it's the youth that is more easily radicalized. Action should be taken to address their problems and listen to their needs. And specifically in protracted conflicts where a status quo is entrenched for more than 30 years, what would the youth want? We often assume that we know what they want because of the narrative that we hear in the media. However, everything we hear is edited and comes through a certain lens. It's the OSCE operations that actually can have access with programs to what the younger generations would think. And many might indeed stick to the secessionist narrative. Some, though, might be tired of isolation. Perhaps they would want to travel, to go abroad, study. And in those cases, corridors for communication with the other open. And this is a very first step to rehumanize the other. Because in so many years of a narrative of othering and lack of communication between the two sides, even the fact that the other is also a human is forgotten. And this is where I see the OSCE stepping in, both for early warning in cases of discontent, but also as a facilitator of communication. And this leads to the next point of mediation in separatist conflicts. We need to recognize what is possible and what is not possible in secessionist conflicts. If it is a protracted conflict, the chances of it getting resolved through a mediation are slim. It is not impossible if there is what Tarman called a ripe moment that the mediators have to recognize and seize to convince the parties to sign an agreement. It is not impossible, but it has to converge with conducive conditions domestically and internationally. But in the meantime, and until such favorable conditions arise, mediators could focus on lower-level negotiations on measures that would improve the everyday life of citizens. For example, issues of documentation in cases of medical emergencies, sufficient energy and water supply in the secessionist entity, a law books or any kinds of goods coming in. Perhaps create the conditions for trade that can also serve as confidence-building measure or mutual recognition of educational qualifications, and that would also serve the interest of the youth. So everyday things that we take for granted in a fully fledged state, but they are not in a secessionist setting. And moving on to the final part of policy recommendations, it is very difficult to give targeted recommendations to such a diverse audience like parliaments, but also such a diverse organization like the OSCE. Every structure and institution of the OSCE has their own mandates, and even now that we are here, so the OSCE takes decisions by consensus, but the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly by majority voting, and this completely changes the dynamics and possible outcomes. So based on what I've talked about thus far, it makes more sense to focus on recommendations for the Secretariat and mainly for the mediation support team, and conclude with recommendations for parliamentarians. So first and foremost, there is a need for multi-level dialogue, and the OSCE is doing that already. The OSCE should build on the expertise that it has on this, and it should continue creating regular opportunities for different forms of dialogue between conflict parties. They can encompass track 1, 2, or 3 activities, and they do not necessarily have to address the root causes of the conflict. So depending on the setting, they can be platforms for engagement, so create the space for the warring parties to meet, and even before a peace process officially begins. implementation reviews, so once an agreement is reached, provisions related to evaluating the process in the implementation of a peace agreement or specific provisions of the peace agreements. Hence, embed dispute resolutions provisions within the agreements. The OSCE consensus decision-making and long-standing experience and involvement in particular regions can place its mediators at a comparative advantage when tackling particular conflicts. So its consensus-based mandate, if used to appoint mediators in the conflict, can lead to the OSCE-appointed mediators being perceived as impartial and legitimate. And the lack of resources can be circumvented through voluntary contributions that should preferably also enjoy wide support among participating states. And the OSCE can be a supporting organization. It already supports reforms for EU integration in the Balkans. It can also support the UN or regional organizations in mediating the conflict through technical expertise and through its missions in the post-conflict phase. The OSCE is good at it, being at the local level in small places where no other or international organizations go. These are the most important places for early warning and conflict prevention. They are also the most important places for post-conflict rehabilitation. And here's also the work the OSCE is doing in the gender sphere. There should be greater synergy between the field operations, the mediation support team, the gender issues program, and the advisor on youth and security. The High Commission on National Minorities should also be informed and involved in cases of concern. Insights from all these perspectives should come together to create the conditions of feedback loops that prevent conflict outbreaks. So what is happening on the ground, what needs change, how can international organizations and the OSCE support it? Only that way there can be a chance for local ownership of the peace. And I would like to finish with the role of parliaments. Conflict is a political thing. No conflict can end if there is no political will. Parliaments, if it is their own conflict, can support or at least not obstruct the peace process, so work towards peace. Parliaments would be good not to undermine the initiation of first steps towards resolution, not to act as spoilers if there is a chance for a conflict to end. In the post-conflict phase, the role of the parliaments is of paramount importance to ratify the agreement and to implement it by passing the laws stipulated in the peace agreements. If it's not their own conflict, parliaments can help with the financial support of post-conflict reconstruction, approve allocation of resources for the reconstruction of the physical space that got damaged during the war, and also approve resources for action that would strengthen post-conflict society. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that the message from all our speakers, and especially from Dr. Karzonaki, was that all conflicts can end if only there is enough political will. And that is on our shoulders, dear colleagues. So we have heard very interesting presentations, and now I hope to hear from many of you. I hope that you will take this opportunity not only to reflect on what we have heard, but also to share your thoughts and ideas about the role of our organization in these very difficult times. The registration for the list of speakers is already closed, but if anyone still wishes to take the floor, I would kindly ask you to approach our Secretariat colleagues at the podium. Please also share your prepared remarks in advance with the Secretariat to facilitate the work of the interpreters. I have 36 speakers on my list. As we have limited time until 6:30 p.m., I will ask you to please keep your remarks to 3 minutes so that we can hear from everybody. And I first give the floor to Ms. Paula Cardoso from Portugal, and she will be followed by Mikita Poturayev from Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Portuguese delegation, I would like to make the following statement. Whether we are discussing the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine or the conflict in the Middle East involving Israel, Hamas, Lebanon, and now Iran, we, as parliamentarians, must condemn the aggressor, denounce the crimes of war, and uphold the principles of human rights and international law. We must also defend the principle of dialogue. We must build bridges, foster cooperation, and reinforce confidence between dead parties whenever it's possible. Yesterday, we all have witnessed a dangerous escalation in the conflict in the Middle East with Iranian attacks against Israel. I believe that we all condemn this attack. But we must also defend that international organizations like the OSCE and the United Nations should have a greater involvement in all possible mediation efforts. Closing doors to mediation is the wrong option. That is why we believe that today's announcement by the Israeli government to declare the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, as a persona non grata and banning him from entering Israel is a decision that we must not support. It's a step in the wrong direction when the conflict is already spiraling out of control. Things are getting worse in a way that becomes more and more difficult to reduce tensions. To exclude the United Nations Secretary General and by definition the United Nations from the efforts to mediate and de-escalate this conflict, it's a wrong and dangerous decision. Multilateral organizations are space for dialogue. If we kill this dialogue, we have nothing left. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cardoso, and I now give the floor to Mr. Mikita Poturayev from Ukraine, and he will be followed by Mr. Robin Wagner from Germany.
Madam President, distinguished colleagues. Yes, let's talk about negotiations, political will, peace and victory. Well, is peace possible with someone who denies your right to exist? Is peace possible with someone who says you personally do not have right to live? That your nation should not exist, that your language, culture, and state should have no place on this planet. What then can you discuss with such people or states? Your tombstone in a cemetery? The color of flowers on your grave? The content of funeral speeches? What is the subject of such negotiations, colleagues? They wish for your death. And you either agree to die or you strive for victory. The victory of life, your personal life, over the death your enemy desires. These days, there is much talk about a Ukrainian victory, but victory is always universal. Victory means only one thing, the inability of your enemy to continue fighting. And it doesn't matter much whether it's military, technological, or economic incapability. What matters is this: those who wish death upon others, those who deny others the right to personal or civil life, the right to national or state existence must be defeated. And they must no longer be able to attack those who seek peace, security, and cooperation. So, what kind of negotiations should be there? About peace, but not about defeat. What kind of peace? The peace of freedom, but not of slavery. What path leads to peace? The path of victory, which means life. A dignified and free human life, for which, unfortunately, sometimes someone had to die through all modern human history. As today, the best daughters and sons of Ukraine are dying right now. They face death today so that tomorrow our descendants can have life. That is why they have already won. Just as Ukraine will inevitably win, just as having gained in the long run all its strength, resilience, and confidence, the entire free democratic world must eventually prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Robin Wagner from Germany, and he will be followed by Ms. Lucy Potutskova from Czechia.
Frau Präsidentin, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen! Die große Gefahr in dieser Zeit ist, dass wir abstumpfen in unserer Wahrnehmung. Gestern Nachmittag sind Terroristen mit einem Sturmgewehr in einer Straßenbahn in Tel Aviv losgezogen und haben wahllos Menschen erschossen. Kurz danach die Raketen aus dem Iran in blinder Zerstörungswut. Und wie blind die Zerstörungswut war, sieht man auch daran, dass das Todesopfer, was sie gekostet haben, ein palästinensischer Mann im Westjordanland war. In den Tagen davor weiter ständiger Raketenbeschuss der Hisbollah, unter anderem auf Nazareth, eine mehrheitlich arabische Stadt in Israel. Aber weiter natürlich auch die Realität, das dramatische Leid der Zivilbevölkerung in Gaza und im Libanon und potenziell auch bei einer israelischen Reaktion im Iran von Menschen, die vom menschenverachtenden Regime der Islamischen Republik unterdrückt werden und die sich auch Frieden, Menschenrechte, Freiheit wünschen und dafür verhaftet, gefoltert und gehängt werden. Und der weiter verschleppten über 100 Geiseln, die Hamas vor einem Jahr verschleppt hat. Meine eigene persönliche Geschichte ist eng verbunden mit der internationalen Rotkreuzbewegung und der wichtigste Grundsatz war da immer und ist immer noch "Even wars have rules". Und ich leide mit jedem toten Zivilisten und unsere Gedanken und Gebete sollten bei allen Getöteten und Leidenden sein. Ich hoffe auf ein Schweigen der Waffen, auf ein Ende des Tötens und dem gilt auch der akute diplomatische Einsatz Deutschlands. Aber mittelfristig reicht ein Schweigen der Waffen nicht. Frieden ist mehr als das Schweigen der Waffen. Frieden braucht Sicherheit, Freiheit und Verlässlichkeit. Wir haben bitter lernen müssen, den Worten von Extremisten zu glauben. Alle haben Wladimir Putin für verrückt gehalten, als er geschrieben hat, es gebe keine Ukraine und alles sei Russland. Viele haben gesagt, die Hamas schreibt zwar, dass sie Israel zerstören will, aber das sei nur Rhetorik. Und manche haben gesagt, der Iran rede radikal, aber verhalte sich rational. Wir sehen an jeder einzelnen Stelle, dass Worte von Extremisten ernst gemeint sein können. Putin überzieht seit 2,5 Jahren die Ukraine mit dem schrecklichen Krieg. Die Hamas will weiter Israel zerstören und opfert dafür die Bevölkerung, über die sie die faktische Kontrolle in Gaza ausübt und Verantwortung tragen sollte. Und Iran ist ein Strippenzieher internationaler Destabilisierung und von Terror und Gewalt. Und jeder dieser Pläne verstößt gegen das Fundament, auf dem unsere regionale Organisation baut, gegen die großen diplomatischen Errungenschaften des vergangenen Jahrhunderts. Und mit dieser Realität muss jede zu findende Lösung für echten Frieden arbeiten. Und das Sehen muss wirklicher Frieden Sicherheit, Freiheit und Verlässlichkeit schützen. Die gemeinsame vereinende Perspektive aus physischer, auch militärischer Sicherheit, Menschenrechten, Stabilität, Fortschritt für alle Menschen und Frieden, das ist eine, die den Helsinki-Prozess ausgezeichnet hat. Und diese Perspektive kann es sein, die wir auch heute immer wieder aus unserer Organisation in die Debatten einbringen. Und ich ende auch dabei mit dem Gewöhnungseffekt, über den ich gesprochen habe und den wir nicht eintreten lassen dürfen. Ich habe zu Beginn über den iranischen Angriff und den Terror gegen Israel gesprochen. Gestern hat Russland wieder einmal Cherson angegriffen. Die alltägliche Situation, Raketen, die Menschen töten. Wir dürfen uns nicht daran gewöhnen und immer weiter für den Frieden arbeiten. Danke.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Lucy Potutskova from Czechia, and she will be followed by Mr. Birger Thorarensson from Iceland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, as we are all aware, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly serves as a unique platform for dialogue and diplomacy. The focus of this session is the role of our organization in conflict resolution, and the question is, what can we truly achieve? First, we can facilitate a dialogue among conflicting parties, offering a neutral forum for discussion and bridging divides. This is the foundation of our efforts in diplomacy. Second, we can promote confidence-building measures between conflicting sides. These efforts may include joint projects, exchanges, and communication initiatives that foster trust. Third, we can engage with non-state actors, including civil society organizations, youth groups, and women organizations. Their involvement is crucial in achieving lasting peace and understanding. Fourth, we can leverage the expertise of our members, many of whom have unique insights into regional conflicts. This is an invaluable resource. By utilizing the knowledge and experience of parliamentarians from affected regions, we can tailor our mediation efforts to the specific needs and dynamics of each conflict. However, what we excel at most is using our experience to strengthen democracy and support democratic institutions. With years of valuable experience monitoring elections throughout the OSCE region, we have developed a unique methodology. This expertise is one of our greatest strengths and distinguishes us from other international platforms. We have the ability to identify the early signs of autocratic regimes and the symptoms of weakening democracies. We must bring attention to these issues and, above all, speak openly about them. Our election reports must be as objective and transparent as possible, conveyed in clear language that the general public can understand. This, even if it means that the host state where elections are held may be dissatisfied with the report's findings. After all, democracy cannot be imposed on anyone. It is ultimately up to the people of each country to decide whether they will embrace and protect it or allow it to be undermined or even hijacked from them. In conclusion, I express my hope that we will continue to support as many election observation missions as possible, and that member states will give due consideration to the recommendation in our final reports. As parliamentarians, this is not just our job, it is our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Birgir Thorarinsson from Iceland, and he will be followed by Mr. Shane Castles from Ireland.
Madam President, we all know that conflict prevention plays a vital role in our efforts to promote peace and stability across the OSCE region. But you also know that OSCE and the international community at large failed to prevent the conflict between Russia and Ukraine from turning into a full-scale war. This failure of prevention had many reasons, but the lack of early warning signs was not one of them. The organization was created to serve as a multilateral forum for dialogue and negotiation between the East and West. There has been no international consensus on how to respond to Russia's aggression, and we see that our tools for handling this instability are weak. We need to ask ourselves, do we have the peacemaking system equipped to deal with this type of major power aggression? Moscow has not shown any interest in serious peace negotiation, and its forces have committed horrific atrocities. Even experts who generally argue for non-military responses to conflict have had to admit that there is a solid case for arming Ukraine within limits, as long as Russia refuses to engage in credible talks. Finding a political solution to the war has not been a priority for many Western countries. Russia's war on Ukraine has demonstrated the flaws in our work. We should certainly not pressure Ukraine into peace on Russia terms, but we are the leading organization addressing security and stability in Europe, and we must act. We need to ask ourselves, will we be successful in our work if we ignore the aggressor, if we tell him that we don't speak with him, that we tell him that we don't want him in the meeting room? That is exactly what we did in the Ministerial Council meeting in Poland. We banned the Russian foreign minister. That meeting was a failure. We failed to adopt any decisions. I personally would like to see Mr. Lavrov walking into our meeting room, sweating under his shirt and stressed, rather than saving him from facing us by banning him. I know this is hard for the Ukrainians, and we stand firmly with the Ukrainians. But if this organization continues to ignore the aggressor, we will get us nowhere. The novelist and playwright James Arthur Baldwin once said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Shane Castles from Ireland, and he will be followed by Mr. Sarkis Kandanian from Armenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Can I first of all welcome you and Roberto, our Secretary General, and all of my colleagues from across Europe to Dublin And after 9 years as a member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, it's fantastic to have you all here in Ireland. So you are very welcome, Kate Míle Fáilte. This meeting in Dublin could not happen at a more opportune time, and we've heard that from our contributions already from our many parliamentarians who are experiencing conflict in their own countries. I have just come back from Zagreb at the weekend, where I was joined with a number of parliamentarians from the OSCE at a special European dialogue meeting discussing navigating conflict in a changing world. One of our sessions, as we were discussing post-conflict scenarios here this afternoon, one of our sessions focused on the ethics of political commemorations. And as we all know as parliamentarians, the commemoration of past conflicts can reignite old hatreds, and the divides can be more divisive than the original conflicts if we do not handle them correctly. We looked at the erection of statues, the naming of streets after the Second World War. We even discussed the grave of Tito in Slovenia. One country was held up as a shining light. That country was Ireland. Our expert, Professor Hans Gutberg from Georgia, spoke of how Ireland had successfully marked their potentially divisive decade of commemorations, marking seminal events in Irish history from 1912 to 1923 that honoured moments from our Irish Republican past, such as our independence war with Britain, and those who came from the Unionist tradition with Britain and the marking of World War I. The fact that we could mark all of these painful events with dignity, something that would have been unimaginable in the Ireland I grew up in as a child, is due to the leadership of the man that was with us here on the stage, Bertie Ahern, who crafted and signed our peace accord with Britain that has lasted for over 25 years. And people are alive today because of his efforts, which ended the needless killing of innocent people. He is the embodiment of how politics works when leaders show real courage, and how conflicts can be resolved and hatred can end. And I think that is the message we should all leave Dublin with, a message of hope. I thank Bertie Ahern for giving that hope to the people of Ireland, and I hope that that flows through all of the parliamentarians here over the next 2 days. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Sargis Kandanian from Armenia, and he will be followed by Honorary Percy Down from Canada.
Madam President, one of the core mandates of the OSCE, particularly through its Minsk Group co-chairmanship, has been to provide a viable framework for conflict resolution between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Regrettably, these efforts were not sufficient for bringing lasting peace, and our region has endured 30 years of war and destruction, the forced displacement of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, the devastation of Armenian cultural heritage, and the continuing issue of prisoners of war reflect the harsh reality we face. This Assembly has been a witness to all of this, serving as a platform for the debates and arguments between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But today I am here with a desire to turn the page on this long history of conflict. I come with a message of cautious optimism, because peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is not just a distant hope. It is possible, and it is within our grasp. Recently, Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a regulation on joint activity of the Commissions on the delimitation of the state border between two countries, adopting the Almaty Declaration as the foundation for this delimitation process. Armenia's Constitutional Court has confirmed that the regulation aligns fully with our constitution, and we expect parliamentary ratification in the coming weeks. What is now required is the next decisive step, the signing of the peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The leadership of both countries has acknowledged that the draft agreement is nearly finalized, and Armenia has taken the initiative by offering to sign the already agreed upon terms. This would serve as a crucial step towards resolving the remaining contentious issues. As former Prime Minister Bertie Ahern said earlier today, peace is not an event, it's a process. Furthermore, Armenia remains committed to discussing the modalities for unblocking regional transport and economic communications in full respect of each other's sovereignty, jurisdiction, and territorial integrity. We seek to transform our region from a theater of conflict into a crossroads of peace. Armenia stands ready for dialogue, yet we have seen a concerning lack of political will from Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, we continue to face new claims, threats, and demands, but we cannot afford to let this opportunity slip away. This is why, dear colleagues, we look to you and your governments for steadfast support by maintaining your focus on the South Caucasus. Despite the challenges of global crisis, you can help secure a lasting and comprehensive peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Honorary Percy Down from Canada, and he will be followed by Mr. Eugenio Toffoli from Italy.
Colleagues, we are gathered today at a challenging time for peace in our region. It has been more than 2.5 years since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and more than a decade since Russia illegally seized other parts of the Ukrainian nation. The war in Ukraine is the largest and deadliest war in Europe since the Second World War. In the face of Russia's ongoing aggression, brave people in Ukraine fight every day against Russia. We also see examples of Ukrainian strength and resistance in other areas, including in this assembly, where Ukrainian delegates work to counter Russian disinformation and propaganda. In this time of conflict in our region, the OSCE and the OSCE EPA must take action to reinforce our peace and security. As the theme of this session highlights, conflict prevention, mediation, and dialogue are at the heart of what the OSCE and the OSCE EPA are about. It is critical, therefore, that all participating states provide the OSCE and the OSCE EPA with the resources necessary to fulfill its conflict prevention and resolution mandate. This means supporting and funding the network of field operations. One of the organization's greatest strengths, these field operations help host countries meet their obligations while also fostering regional security through early warning and conflict prevention initiatives. We should also ensure that election observation remains a bedrock of the OSCE peace and security toolbox. I commend the OSCE and the OSCE EPA for the recent and upcoming work to monitor elections across the region. Free and fair elections are vital to stability and to building peace. It is for this reason that the OSCE view of security is so vital to understanding conflict and how to respond to it. During our sessions this week, I urge us to think about ways that we can reinforce our regional peace and security initiatives and structures. The first step is for our members to continue to support for Ukraine. We all know that Russia is a criminal organization masquerading as a government. They must be stopped now. Thank you, colleagues. Rounding applause.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Eugenio Toffoli from Italy, and he will be followed by Mr. Per Pons from Spain.
Grazie Presidente Kauma. A nome della delegazione italiana ringrazio innanzitutto la Presidenza, il Segretariato, gli speaker che mi hanno preceduto per gli ottimi spunti che hanno voluto condividere qui, e un grazie particolare alla delegazione irlandese per l'ospitalità. Capodelegazione CRID, la vostra isola è stupenda e siamo orgogliosi di essere qui. In riferimento ai concetti chiavi di facilitazione, dialogo, mediazione, risoluzione e conciliazione che sono stati appena approfonditi, vorrei focalizzare l'attenzione sulla prevenzione, un tassello che dovrebbe essere posto alla base del ciclo virtuoso che caratterizza l'azione della nostra organizzazione nella gestione dei conflitti. Il dialogo e la diplomazia preventiva sono strumenti essenziali per la prevenzione dei conflitti, in quanto consentono di disinnescare potenziali crisi prima che si trasformino in conflitti aperti.
L'OSCE ha una tradizione consolidata nel campo della prevenzione dei conflitti. I suoi strumenti di prevenzione precoce, come il meccanismo di Vienna, il Centro per la prevenzione dei conflitti e le missioni sul campo, come quelle anche di monitoraggio elettorale, offrono un quadro operativo per monitorare situazioni potenzialmente instabili. In questo contesto la dimensione parlamentare permette di attribuire al concetto di prevenzione una forza maggiore, veicolando la volontà dei popoli. È tuttavia necessario rafforzare il canale della diplomazia parlamentare. Dobbiamo fare uno sforzo in più che sfrutti la conoscenza della cultura locale, il legame con la società proprio dei parlamentari per promuovere un clima di fiducia reciproca e di confronto. La prevenzione dei conflitti è infatti più efficace se avviene all'interno di una collaborazione che esalti la capacità di anticipare, di leggere e decodificare segnali, contesti e attitudini suscettibili di provocare collisioni. Quanto apprendiamo va interpretato alla luce dei differenti sistemi di valori, poiché un'informazione grezza può avere significati diversi. Soltanto assieme possiamo cogliere le implicazioni e le sfumature di ogni segnale e di ogni rumore. Come membri dell'Assemblea parlamentare abbiamo la responsabilità di usare tutti gli strumenti a nostra disposizione per promuovere il dialogo, facilitare la diplomazia preventiva anche attraverso iniziative che favoriscono la trasparenza e il rispetto dei principi fondamentali della sicurezza europea. Anche per questo motivo, e concludo, dovremmo confrontarci in modo ancor più approfondito per ottenere quella sicurezza che i nostri concittadini desiderano. In conclusione, con la certezza che l'impegno dei nostri governi sarà massimo per evitare l'escalation ovunque si combatta, il mio più grande auspicio è che la fine dell'anno in corso ci avvicini alla pace e sia spezzata la spirale di violenza, perché la guerra è sempre morte, tragedia e sconfitta per il genere umano. Grazie.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Per Pons from Spain, and he will be followed by Dr. Daniela de Ritter from Germany.
So first of all, thank you, Madam President, for the dialogue and for the opportunity to exchange with Bertie Arends and the other panelists, and thank you very much to the Irish delegation for hosting this meeting. And to not repeat again what other colleagues said, I would like to say that it's also important to first start saying that we are in a worse situation than a year ago. After a year of conflict, we are in a war situation. So this would be my first point. The second point is a little bit of autocriticism, because conflicts are not popping up from nowhere. And in the last years, in this global and polarized world, many forces insufflate hate, xenophobia, populism, and are helping to increase the level of polarization and insufflating also conflict to our parliaments and to our societies. And it's very obvious what is going on, for example, in many regions. By the way, if you bombard civilians and you decide that international law is not respected, don't be surprised if you generate more conflict and you generate the roots of terrorism, for example. It seems that also we should be a little bit more careful about authoritarian democracies. It seems that we are coping more and more with this kind of phenomena. I would like to ask to the panelists, how do they imagine how we can dialogue with authoritarian regimes, which are called pseudo-democracies or whatever you want to call it. And just another thing, there was an article today on the press, in the Spanish press, saying that it's very difficult to generate trust if you have double standards when you look at one conflict like Ukraine or another one like Middle East. If you have double standards, it's impossible to create trust among the, let's say, the society of the society of the South, for example. So I think it's important to end with a question about really, for the panelists, what is the added value of the OCPA in this polarized world in which we are also part of of the problem. Thank you.
I will give at the end of this session the possibility for the panelists to respond to these questions if possible. But now I give the floor to Mrs. Daniela de Ridder from Germany, and she will be followed by Mr. Tom Clonan from Ireland.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin, für die Worterteilung. Ich bin nach Irland, nach Dublin gekommen in großer Dankbarkeit. Und ich will gestehen, dass ich, bevor ich dieses Programm begann, das EPIC-Museum, das nur wenige Meter von unserem Tagungsort entfernt ist, besucht habe. Wenn Sie, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, mehr über Irland, aber auch mehr über Konfliktbeilegung lernen wollen, dann besuchen Sie bitte auch dieses Museum. Selbstverständlich nicht während unserer Sessions, aber vielleicht davor oder danach. Sie lernen dort, dass Hunger, Krieg und Krisen zu einer Vernichtung werden können für eine ganze Nation. Irland hat, und das hat Bertie Ahern deutlich gemacht in seinen Worten, diese Krise aber überwunden. Als ich ein kleines Mädchen war, sprachen wir zu Hause nur über die IRA, wenn wir an Irland dachten. Und es ist gut, dass dies überwunden werden konnte. Bertie Ahern bin ich aber auch sehr dankbar, weil er das Thema der Frauen angesprochen hat. Und ich hatte Gelegenheit, vor wenigen Wochen nach Israel und nach Palästina zu reisen, nach Tel Aviv, Ostjerusalem und nach Ramallah. Und ich habe dort viele Gespräche mit Frauen geführt. Und ein wesentliches Problem dieses Konfliktes, den wir als Middle East-Konflikt bezeichnen, ist die sexualisierte Gewalt, denen Frauen auf allen Seiten ausgeliefert sind. Dieser Konflikt muss uns lehren, dass Renitenz und Resilienz sehr nahe beieinander liegen. Und wenn es die OSZE noch nicht gäbe, muss sie angesichts dieses Konflikts neu erfunden werden. Und deshalb bin ich auch froh, dass vom Podium aus die Botschaft an uns gelangt, dass wir als Parlamentarierinnen und Parlamentarier eine positive Rolle zu spielen haben und wir mehr als nur ein Instrument haben. Ich bin wiedergekommen von meiner Reise nach Israel und der Westbank mit einer, ich will durchaus gestehen, tiefen Depression. Getröstet hat mich aber gestern der ukrainische Kollege Artur Gerasimov, der noch einmal deutlich gemacht hat, dass der Nahe Osten und der Krieg gegen die Ukraine durchaus dieselben Akteure kennt im Hintergrund. Auch hinter dem Iran steckt Russland und sein unseliger Einfluss. Er hat aber gleichwohl auch deutlich gemacht, lassen Sie mich dies bitte betonen, dass wir alle Gesprächskanäle, auch wenn wir sie zurzeit nicht nutzen können, versuchsweise offen halten müssen. Ich danke Artur Gerasimov für diese Ermutigung und will deutlich machen, wie wichtig die Zivilcourage an dieser Stelle ist, wie wichtig kohärente Politik zur Überwindung solcher Krisen ist. Auch das lehren uns unsere Gastgeber. Wir können alle, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Frau Präsidentin, voneinander lernen, und wir müssen dies auch. Demokratie zeigt uns auf, wenn wir sie behalten und erhalten wollen, dass wir dafür kämpfen müssen. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Tom Clonan from Ireland, and he will be followed by Mrs. Magabo-Chorishvili from Georgia.
Bienvenue, willkommen, laskawa prossimo, benvenuto, benvenida, dobrodošli, kolokorizma, vutimi, vicietje, ahalan musahalan, and to our English friends, welcome. Falcheriv galer gudi balya clia. I'm very proud to welcome you to Dublin, my home city. In the conversation about conflict, I began my career as a young army officer, working for OSCE in Bosnia-Herzegovina at the end of that war, at the end of that conflict. So I've seen with my own eyes the impact of positive, constructive intervention, overarching and driven and guided by our national parliamentarians. As we speak, Israeli troops have entered Lebanon and are moving towards the Litani River and are fighting in villages like Ras al-Maroun, a village I'm very well acquainted with, where Irish troops are serving. and Israel has begun the slaughter of innocent Lebanese men, women and children in exactly the same manner that they did in Gaza. In this room, we also have people who have troops in South Lebanon from Serbia, Germany, Finland, Poland, France, Greece, Italy. And it is a very difficult moment for the families of those troops because we are the eyes and ears of the international community that bear witness to the slaughter. It is a fact that Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Israeli military have broken the laws of armed conflict and have abandoned the rules-based order. They are war criminals committing war crimes on a daily, hourly basis. And as the Count Korla pointed out in his opening speech, what of the Duma in relation to Russian war crimes in Ukraine? What of the Knesset, our brothers and sisters who serve in that parliament? What do they say about the war crimes committed on their behalf by the Israeli Defense Forces at Netanyahu's direction? We have, at this point, on the point of a massive confrontation between Iran, Israel, the United States, we have a duty as parliamentarians to speak out for peace. And what is the common causal element? If you look at the names, Netanyahu, Putin, Nasrallah, Al-Khamenei, Kim Jong-un, and possibly Trump, what do all of these people have in common? Toxic masculinity and patriarchy. This is the absolute distillation of patriarchal systems and patriarchal thought, which is the killing of innocent men, women, and children. In order for this to stop, as our former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern said, we must empower women and girls all over the world, and we must increase the participation of women and feminist thought and feminist perspectives to end conflict and to save our planet and our species from self-destruction. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mrs. Maka Bochorisvili and from Georgia, and she will be followed by Ms. Kinsburska from Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, the fundamental goal of this organization is to ensure security and cooperation in Europe, although we constantly need to discuss conflicts and challenges to security. Georgia is the OSCE participating state that has been experiencing the consequences of neglecting international norms for decades. Conflict, violation of territorial integrity, occupation of 2 regions of Georgia by Russia and its illegal military presence there. These are the challenges that my country has been facing for more than 3 decades now. The declared policy of the government of Georgia is pursuit of peaceful ways of conflict resolution and restoration of Georgia's territorial integrity by peaceful means. Many international actors are involved in the process, including the OSCE, although it is very difficult to speak about the success of Geneva international discussions so far. As a result of 10 years' efforts of the Georgian government, today we are also substantiated by decisions of the international courts, and thus we can fight not only with political but also with legal arguments for a peaceful conflict resolution. Dear colleagues, even a glance at the map is sufficient to realize in what a complex environment we strive to ensure stable paths of democratic development for the country and to maintain peace. During recent years, Georgia has repeatedly faced the threat of destabilization, which makes the security of the country even more vulnerable. We have also seen many campaigns of international scale which mostly are devoid of objective foundations but harms the reputation of the country. The important parliamentary elections are ahead of us. It is the interest of the government that elections are held in compliance with the rules and international standards, not to let anybody undermine elections and to pose a question about the choice of Georgian citizens, as it has already happened in the past. At the invitation of the Georgian authorities, you will have the possibility to observe elections and to make objective conclusions. Your mission is far more than observation of elections. Today, preserving stability and peace in Georgia is necessary not only for us, but for the security of the entire region. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Ms. Ginsburska from Ukraine, and she will be followed by Ms. Monika Tsaikova from North Macedonia.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, today I stand before you to talk about a city that has become more than just a place on the map. Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine, has now become a symbol of endurance, defiance, and the unbreakable spirit of its people. This city, which has faced the horrors of war head-on, remains undaunted, a beacon of hope and resilience that echoes far beyond its borders. But as much as war has taken from this city, it has not taken the spirit of Kharkiv's people. This is a story not of destruction, but of defiance. There is a Ukrainian saying, we were born in great pain, and in pain we will be reborn. In Kharkiv, this rebirth is happening in real time. It happens in the makeshift hospitals where doctors walk around the clock to save lives. It happens in the underground shelters where families huddle together, sharing warm food and stories, refusing to let the darkness of war extinguish the light of humanity. It happens in the faces of the elderly who having survived the hardship of the past, now stand tall in the face of this new cruel chapter in their city's history. For many, Kharkiv's struggle is not just a local battle. It is a part of a larger fight for freedom and democracy. This city, once a center of Soviet influence, now stands at the front line of the battle between tyranny and liberty. Every day that Kharkiv stands, it sends a message to the world. Ukrainian will not be silenced, freedom will not be crushed. The fight for Kharkiv is the fight for the soul of a nation. Kharkiv will not be remembered for its ruins, but for its resilience. It will not be a story of a city defeated by war, but of a city that stood tall in the face of unimaginable hardship. A city that, despite being pushed to the brink, never lost its souls. And so, as we stand here today, let us honor Kharkiv not with a pity, but with an admiration. Let us stand with Kharkiv not out of obligation, but out of solidarity. Let us remember that in the heart of Ukraine there beats a city that refuses to die, a city that refuses to be silenced, a city that no matter how many bombs fall, will always remain unbroken. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Monika Tsaikova from North Macedonia, and she will be followed by Farah Karimi from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Ms. Chairperson, dear colleagues, I'm sure we all agree that the world today is far from a safe place to live in. Within the growing complexity of today's security challenges, OSCE must be ready to make a magnificent contribution to conflict prevention and peace building whenever and wherever it can within its broad geographical area. To that end, flexibility is required, as are sufficient financial and human resources, as the cost of crisis management far outweighs the cost of prevention actions. Nonetheless, recent years have witnessed a continuous decrease in the OSCE's unified budget, constraining the organization's ability to respond to emerging tensions and to address root causes of conflict. Political will is more than needed to unleash the OSCE's potential and make full use of its mandate and capabilities. This is a difficult time for Europe and for the security in Europe, as well as for the world, and such situation causes global economic, energy, and humanitarian crisis. But we cannot even imagine how the Ukrainians or the people from the Middle East feel. So we need to listen to them and give them the support they need and be ready for greater sacrifices to help them. They die and we are not. The war in the Middle East and in Ukraine is affecting civilians, women, children, and civilian infrastructure. The OSCE participating states should assist in addressing the humanitarian crisis and provide constant support with full bilateral and multilateral mechanisms. Dear colleagues, in times when the OSCE is seriously tested and the trust and dialogue as the main pillars of the organization are gravely undermined, we should quickly adapt to the changing circumstances and make the organization fit its purpose and boost its relevance. We also need to promote the role of the OSCE in advocating democracy, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, as well as to ensure the relevance of the OSCE-PA and preserve its independence, openness for dialogue, inclusivity, and flexibility. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Ms. Farah Karimi from the Netherlands, and she will be followed by Mr. Ville Skinnari from Finland.
Thank you, Madam President. Human history is filled with atrocities, war crimes, and genocide. Yet, civilization was meant to bring progress, advancing human rights, humanitarian laws, and international peace. Even wars were supposed to have rules. But the events of the last year following the Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel, which I strongly condemn, show a different reality. The war on the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank has broken every law. Babies, children, women, schools, hospitals, and aid workers have been mercilessly bombed. In February, the International Court of Justice was clear about a plausible genocide in Gaza. And now we face the terrifying possibility of a regional war. What seemed impossible a year ago, the risk of a Third World War, is now dangerously close. I hold Netanyahu and his extremist government fully responsible, along with the international supporters of his genocidal war. Some of these warmongers, eager for more bloodshed in the Middle East, are unfortunately, and this is really very difficult for me to say, but unfortunately, members of our Assembly. As someone who experienced the inside of Iran's regime presence, I will always fight for change in that country and for its people. But this does not justify war against Iran or any other nation. Madam President, this is a plea to all of you colleagues. As we heard, political will is the key for peace, and we are politicians. We must uphold what humanity has achieved through diplomacy, human rights, and international law for everyone, everywhere. We cannot serve the agenda of an extremist Israeli government, indifferent even to the fate of the hostages held by Hamas. Those advocating war must realize that a regional war will have severe consequences worldwide, and particularly on Europe. It is time to reject war, stop sending weapons to Israel, financing Netanyahu's war, and stop repeating his narrative of self-defense while actively killing and destroying so many lives. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Ville Skinnari from Finland, and he will be followed by Mr. Bård Hogsrud from Norway.
Madam Chair, dear colleagues, as we must condemn all war crimes and violations of international law, we must also focus at the same time on conflict prevention. OSCE field operations and networks in the grassroots level are vital in supporting conflict prevention and resolutions. Therefore, supporting early engagement through OSCE tools and creating more comprehensive toolbox is important. The work in supporting regional cooperative initiatives is of great importance. And I would like to see more of that, but what is the reality? Too many governments are cutting development finance. At the same time, private sector has become more and more hesitant for investments. We need to recognize that development policy is a crucial part of foreign and security policy. And ladies and gentlemen, it is our duty as parliamentarians to make sure that we have tools in our toolbox. Therefore, OSCE should show now strategic leadership, ability with the vision and implementation, and accelerate solutions in those fields where it's feasible and doable, utilizing the entities, financing, and so forth, what is available in this world from the private and governmental sector. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Bård Hoksrud from Norway, and he will be followed by Mr. Kemal Çelik from Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. A big thank you to the delegation of Ireland for hosting this annual session here in wonderful Dublin. Firstly, I would like to underline the importance of the OSCE. I like also to thank Finland for taking on next year's chairmanship. We hope that under your leadership, the OSCE will become even more relevant, both as a platform for political dialogue and as an effective actor in crisis management, reinforcing its role as a cornerstone of European security. Secondly, allow me to mention that the Storting hosted a meeting of the Young Parliamentarians Network recently. The topic was energy security, and the meeting took place in the energy capital in Norway, Stavanger. The city is also the hometown of Alexander Stokkebø, alternate member of our delegation and deputy head of the network. We are grateful that so many members took part, and particularly happy that the Ukrainian was able to present at the meeting. Finally, let me underline that the Norwegian support for Ukraine remains as strong as ever. Recently, our government broadened its commitment to Ukraine through the Nansen program. All the parties in our parliament agree on this program. The brutal attacks on Ukraine that we have witnessed recently only strengthen our resolve. Norway will continue its military and civilian support so that the Ukraine is able to defend itself against Russia's illegal war of aggression. Russia started this war. Russia can choose to end it at any time. Norway will never cease to call on Russia to stop its military actions immediately and unconditionally. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Kemal Çelik from Turkey, and he will be followed by Mr. Pavlov Rolov from Ukraine.
Değerli Başkan, Agit bölgesinde ve çevresinde devam eden çatışmalar ve özellikle İsrail'in saldırganlığı hepimiz için endişe kaynağı olmaya devam ediyor. Agit için çatışmalar öncesi ve esnasında barış, arabuluculuk ve uzlaşma için yaptığı çalışmalar, savaşın son bulması ile rehabilitasyon çalışmaları bu bağlamda artık daha önemlidir.
Distinguished Chair, Distinguished President, valuable colleagues, the ongoing conflicts in and around the OSCE region, and especially Israel's aggression, continue to be a cause for concern for all of us. The OSCE's work for peace, mediation, and reconciliation before and during the conflicts, as well as rehabilitation work after the end of the war, are now more important in this context.
Günümüz dünyasının en önemli sorunlarından biri çatışmaların sınırları aşan göç krizlerine yol açmasıdır. Agit'in çatışma döngüsü çerçevesi, göçün altında yatan nedenleri ile ele almak değerli mekanizmalar sunmaktadır. Bunların çoğu çözülmemiş çatışmalar ve istikrarsızlıktan kaynaklanmaktadır.
One of the most important problems of today's world is that conflicts lead to migration crises that cross borders. The OSCE's conflict cycle framework provides valuable mechanisms for addressing the underlying causes of migration, and many of these actually arise from unresolved conflicts and instability.
AGİT'in aktif bir üyesi olan Türkiye bu tür arabuluculuk çabalarına sürekli olarak desteklemiş ve barışçıl çözümün düzensiz göçü önlemek için önemli bir araç olduğunu vurgulamıştır.
Turkey, an active member of the OSCE, has consistently supported such mediation efforts and emphasized that peaceful resolution is an important tool to prevent irregular migration.
Uzlaşma ve çatışma sonrası rehabilitasyona bakarken göç yönetişiminin önemi daha da belirgin hale gelmiştir. AGİT'in bu aşamalardaki çalışmaları yerinden edilmiş insanların evlerine güvenli bir şekilde dönebilmeleri veya başka yerlerde sürdürülebilir çözümler bulabilmeleri için gerekli koşulların yaratılmasına yardımcı olmaktadır.
As we look towards reconciliation and post-conflict rehabilitation, the importance of migration governance becomes even more evident. The OSCE's work at these stages helps create the conditions for displaced people to return safely to their homes or find sustainable solution elsewhere.
Milyonlarca mülteciye ev sahipliği yapan Türkiye, sürdürülebilir göç yönetişimi için istikrarın öneminin farkındadır. Çatışmalardan etkilenen bölgelerde barış ve güvenliği teşvik için çözümler için çalışırken bir yandan da sığınak sağlamak bu bakımdan ayrıca önem arz etmektedir.
Turkey, hosting millions of refugees, is aware of the importance of stability for sustainable migration governance, providing shelter while working for solutions that promote peace and security in conflict-affected areas is particularly important in that regard.
Ayrıca İsrail'in bugün uyguladığı savaşı başka ülkelere ve bölgeye yayması ve genişletme stratejisi yeni göç dalgalarına sebep olacaktır. O nedenle ilk iş İsrail'in katliamlarına dur demektir. Unutmayalım ki ölen sadece insanlar değil, insanlık da ölmektedir. Teşekkür ederim.
In addition, Israel's current strategy of spreading its war to other countries and the entire region will cause new waves of immigration. Therefore, the first thing to do is to stop Israel's massacres. Let's not forget, not only people die, but the whole humanity is dying. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine, and he will be followed by Mr. Emanuele Loperfido from Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, Ukrainian people have been fighting Russian full-scale military aggression for the third year. Ukraine makes a significant contribution to European and international security, deters the aggressor. Today, investment in the security of Ukraine are investment in the collective security of Europe and all democratic world. We are grateful for the military and financial assistance that Ukraine has received and continues to receive from our partners, but more assistance is needed. It should contain long-range weapons to defeat military targets deep in Russian territory. Today, there should be no red lines for countering the aggressor. In the Kursk region, Ukrainian soldiers showed and continue to show courage. We expect courage from our partners. Sanctions pressure on Russia should be increased until Russia restores respect for the principles of peaceful coexistence of states. Modern technologies have no place in Russia. It is important to prevent the spread of the newest technologies to Russia and other totalitarian countries that threaten democracies. All possible schemes which allow Russia to evade sanctions and use newest technologies should be blocked. International business should stop financing the aggressor country. We call on the representatives of business of your countries who continue working in Russia today to stop financing the aggressor country and leave it as soon as possible. The practical implementation of 10 points of the peace formula of President Zelensky is the only viable way to restore comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine. The first Global Peace Summit in Switzerland proved to be a success demonstrating the unity of the international community, as 101 delegations from all continents took part in it. Such a wide attendance on this event is a clear signal to Moscow that the world does not support Russia's war. The joint communiqué on a peace framework supported by the 94 countries and institutions is a precondition of the organization of the second peace summit to stop Russia's war of aggression. So I call on you, dear parliamentarians, not to reduce but increase military and financial support for Ukraine until Ukraine's victory. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Emanuele Loperfido from Italy, and he will be followed by Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani from Cyprus.
Grazie Presidente, benvenuti a tutti e grazie agli amici irlandesi per questa calda accoglienza nella loro bellissima Dublino e bellissima Irlanda, terra che tanto ha sofferto ma che oggi può essere d'esempio per coloro i quali confidano di poter un giorno arrivare anch'essi alla pace, democrazia e stabilità e la convivenza tra varie anime. Ecco allora che proprio da qui, da Dublino, deve ripartire quello spirito che anche l'Europa ha visto essere quella fiammella che dopo la distruzione della Seconda Guerra Mondiale ha rivisto nazioni che prima erano in conflitto ricostruire col dialogo costante, con la fiducia, con la forza delle istituzioni e della speranza di generare pace, sviluppo e democrazia, arrivare all'Unione Europea, avere Paesi membri che sono anche Paesi membri dell'OSCE, dell'Assemblea OSCE, per fare in modo che appunto tramite il dialogo costante, la ricerca continua del confronto anche tra posizioni diverse si possa arrivare a essere elemento di riferimento per quelle nazioni che oggi, sia all'interno dei Paesi membri OSCE, ma anche Paesi che sono confinanti con l'area OSCE, mi riferisco all'area del Mediterraneo e del Medio Oriente, possono vedere gli organismi internazionali come il nostro quale elemento di fiducia. Ecco allora che da Dublino deve ripartire una sorta di rinnovamento dei valori che hanno portato l'Assemblea OSCE a essere un punto di riferimento per chi vede il dialogo come elemento di pace e stabilità. Fare in modo che quell'approccio multidimensionale per arrivare a utilizzare ogni strumento possibile per quell'obiettivo fondamentale che vede la sicurezza e la cooperazione, quell'elemento che è in grado di generare stabilità, è in grado di generare pace all'interno di un contesto istituzionale di democrazia, libertà individuali e diritti. Quindi usiamo ogni strumento possibile già presente all'interno di questa istituzione per alimentare quella fiducia che noi stessi dobbiamo cercare di infondere nei nostri amici Paesi membri e anche nei Paesi confinanti. Ecco allora che è con piacere che annunciamo questa serie di incontri fatti con il Comitato Antiterrorismo, le Nazioni Unite, che faremo a Roma per indagare, approfondire anche i temi della migrazione, del fatto che la tecnologia può essere utilizzata per fini malevoli e quindi fare in modo che di fronte al terrorismo che vuole ignoranza, vuole povertà, vuole instabilità, vuole mancanza di democrazia, ecco, noi dobbiamo fare in modo di contrastarlo fermamente con gli strumenti che ci sono all'interno dell'OSCE per fare in modo che appunto tramite l'OSCE si possa garantire anche ai nostri Paesi membri la pace, la democrazia, la stabilità ed un futuro appunto di convivenza. Grazie.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, we need to finish this session at 6:30 because we have a reception waiting for us. That means that we only have about 35 minutes left, and therefore I would like to ask you to limit your interventions to 2 minutes if possible. Our next speaker will be Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani from Cyprus, and he will be followed by Ms. Yevrosima Pejovic from Montenegro.
Thank you, Madam President. What we need is to reinforce the role of the parliaments, but also the role of our assembly, in order to be able to better deal with the conflicts in all their phases. It's not enough to remain only by the discussions and dialogue, but it is necessary to create conditions for intervening in conflict cycle, dialogue, facilitation, conflict resolution, mediation, support, conciliation, and post-conflict rehabilitation. As Assembly, we can act much more flexible than the normal diplomacy. We have to follow similar procedure as we do in election observation missions, where we evaluate the proper conduct of the elections based on facts and reports. Therefore, in our case of dealing with the conflicts, we need a substantial, full detailed report for the situation in the field. Dear colleagues, our world is facing two worlds in which the future of Europe and the future of our organization are at stake. On the one hand, we have Russia's military invasion of Ukraine and the continuing occupation of part of Ukraine's territory. On the other hand, we have the unjustified attacks by terrorist organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebel group against the State of Israel, which threaten to escalate the tension in the region, causing a war of enormous proportions. That is why I would like once again to put before the Assembly my proposal for the appointment of the OSCE of special envoys, one for the Ukraine and another one for the Middle East problem. The special envoy will be appointed by the President of the Assembly or by the Bureau of the Assembly and must have clear terms of mandate. He or she must prepare a report on the situation of the conflict as well as his recommendations based on his terms of mandate. He must also be independent and not take part in political discussions on this thematic. Thereafter, the reports will be submitted to the Parliamentary Assembly of the organization and discussed there. I firmly believe that if our discussions on conflicts are based on the relevant reports, we will have better results and we will be able to take better actions and recommendations. This will also give an additional impetus and visibility to our Assembly, thus further enhancing the possibilities for effective mediation where and when needed. Thank you again, Ms. Chair.
Thank you. And I remind again that you should be able to limit your intervention to 2 minutes instead of 3. And our next speaker is Ms. Jevrosima Pejovic from Montenegro, and she will be followed by Mr. Papathanasis from Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear fellow colleagues, Montenegro as a small country is deeply committed to multilateralism. This commitment is rooted in our belief that multilateral organizations such as OSCE have not only stood the test of time, but have proven essential to ensuring peace and stability. As a proud member of the OSCE, Montenegro sees our membership as complementary to our EU aspirations. We recognize that security in the OSCE region cannot be divided. No region can enjoy lasting stability if the security of any part is compromised. At present, war in Ukraine is fracturing the European security architecture, and Montenegro firmly stands with Ukraine. We have accepted the highest number of Ukrainian refugees per capita in Europe, and Montenegro's constant support for the Vienna and Moscow mechanisms demonstrates our commitment to upholding human rights in conflict-affected areas. In the future, comprehensive approach to security will be crucial, especially in post-Russia-Ukraine war era. The OSCE support for the Balkan in the aftermath of our own wars was precious. It helped to rebuild our societies, democracy, and promoted long-term stability. Today, that role is as relevant. Montenegro stands firm in its dedication to the OSCE, confident that this organization remains a cornerstone of Europe's security and multilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Papathanasis from Greece, and he will be followed by Mr. Yaroslav Yursichin from Ukraine.
Honorable Chair, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address this esteemed assembly representing Greece at the OSCE Parliamentary Conference. This session, focused on the conflict cycle, is both crucial and timely. In a world increasingly marked by geopolitical tensions and internal conflict, our collective responsibility to promote peace and stability has never been more urgent. The OSCE's comprehensive approach to security, emphasizing dialogue and cooperation, is vital for effective conflict management. First, dialogue facilitation is the cornerstone of preventive diplomacy. Initiate conversations, lays the groundwork for understanding and trust. Greece, with its rich history of diplomacy, believes in the power of dialogue as the first step towards peace. Second, conflict resolution requires dedicated effort and resources. It is not merely about resolving disputes, but also addressing the underlying causes of conflict. Greece supports initiatives that aim for sustainable solutions, ensuring that peace agreements are inclusive and equitable. Third, mediation support is crucial in bridging differences between conflicting parties. Skilled mediators can guide negotiations towards mutually acceptable agreements. Greece advocates for enhanced training and capacity building for mediations within the OSCE framework. Fourth, conciliations involves mending broken relationships. This process is essential for healing societies torn by conflict. Greece proposes more collaborative projects that bring together divided communities, fostering mutual respect and understanding. Lastly, post-conflict rehabilitation is about rebuilding societies and preventing the resurgence of conflict. Comprehensive strategies that include economic development, social cohesion, and justice are necessary. Greece is committed to supporting OSCE's efforts in post-conflict regions to ensure lasting peace and prosperity. In conclusion, the OSCE's role in managing the conflict cycle is indispensable. Greece reaffirms its commitment to these principles and stands ready to contribute to our shared goal of peaceful, stable, and secure world. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker will be Mr. Yaroslav Yursichin from Ukraine, and he will be followed by Mrs. Lilit Galstian from Armenia.
Thanks a lot, Madam President, and all colleagues. For effective solution of conflicts, we do need a two-way movement, and do understand that only between democracy country or democracy sides it can be. Because when we look on totalitarian or authoritarian regime, we see that they are united. They don't have any limited, and they don't want to solve a conflict. They want just win. We see the Iranian and North Korean weapon without any limitation used by Russia. But in the same time, Ukraine don't have possibility to use Western weapon to stop Russia aggressor. So democracy, it's only one way to solve a conflict, but still democracy must be active, not neutral, not talking, not discussing, but acting. And let's be honest, it's not exist a frozen conflict. We can look on Transnistria or in Moldova or Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. It's just time for totalitarian regime prepared to next attack. And due to that, we do understand that world must act, not be neutral, not be discussable, but acting. And now we see several countries which try to stay neutral. When some criminals interfere or attacking your neighborhoods, began to rape wife, killed children, be neutral, it's a crime too. Thanks.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Ms. Lilith Galstian from Armenia, and she will be followed by Ms. Renata Alt from Germany.
Dear colleagues, over the past 3 years, I used this platform to raise the alarm about the existential threat that the people of Nagorno-Karabakh were facing. I repeatedly asked if we were doing enough to prevent the disaster around us in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or South Caucasus. Or are we satisfied with the reputation and role of our organization? A year ago, the crime of genocide was committed by a member of this organization. In blatant violation of the international court's orders, after a 9-month severe blockade, Azerbaijan launched its military aggression against the starving and deprived native Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, forcing more than 120,000 to flee for life, to leave their millennium-old ancestral land. Many international organizations classified it as a genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Moreover, 205 square kilometers of Armenia's territory is currently occupied by Azeri forces. Our organization is still silent. Petroleum and gas, political expediency are the driving forces of current policy making. All the principles of Helsinki Final Act are disregarded. The prevailing atmosphere of impunity serves as a carte blanche for Azerbaijan and others to commit new war crimes. As of today, in violation of the international humanitarian law, Azerbaijan not only refuses to return all Armenian Poles, the former political and military leadership of Artsakh, but it is also conducting mock trials against them. Azerbaijan continues to erase the Armenian footprint from Artsakh through the systematic destruction of the Armenian cultural and religious heritage. This genocidal act is being presented as restoration of territorial integrity. Dear colleagues, it's a grave mistake to assume that the Karabakh conflict could be resolved through the elimination of the Armenian population and identity. To remedy its reputation and role, OSCE, as an organization that holds Minsk Group mandate, must demand the safe and dignified return of the Armenians of Karabakh under international security guarantees. The right of return is a fundamental human right that applies directly to the forcibly displaced Armenians, and no one can deprive them of their inherent right. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mrs. Renata Alt from Germany, and she will be followed by Mrs. Irina Gerashenko from Ukraine.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen! Die Sicherheitsarchitektur in Europa ist durch Russlands Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine ins Wanken geraten. Menschen im gesamten OSZE-Gebiet sehnen sich nach Frieden und Sicherheit, denn derzeit ist beides massiv bedroht. Als Parlamentarier sind wir uns dieser Bedrohungen und unserer Verantwortung bewusst. Deswegen baut Deutschland derzeit seine militärische Präsenz an der Ostflanke Europas aus. Mit der Brigade Litauen leisten wir unseren Beitrag zur Sicherheit in Europa. Frieden und Sicherheit bedeutet aber nicht nur die militärische Dimension. Beides kann es nicht geben ohne Menschenrechte und ohne Freiheit. Deswegen möchte ich heute Ihre Aufmerksamkeit auf die erschreckenden Menschenrechtsverletzungen in Belarus lenken. In den vergangenen Monaten hat Machthaber Lukaschenko 110 politische Gefangene freigelassen. Aber diese vermeintliche Milde darf uns nicht täuschen. Mehr als 1300 politische Gefangene sind dort weiterhin unter unmenschlichen Bedingungen inhaftiert. Frauen, Ältere, Kranke sind im Gefängnis, weil sie für Demokratie und Freiheit eintreten. Ein besonders tragisches Beispiel ist Maria Kolesnikova. Sie ist eine Symbolfigur des friedlichen Widerstands. Ihr Gesundheitszustand hat sich dramatisch verschlechtert. Seit nun fast 2 Jahren gibt es kein wirkliches Lebenszeichen von ihr. Anwälte dürfen sie nicht besuchen. Es ist eine gezielte Strategie, um sie in Gefängnis zu brechen. Das dürfen wir nicht hinnehmen. Als Wertegemeinschaft müssen wir alle gemeinsam auf Belarus Druck ausüben und für die Freilassung der politischen Gefangenen weiterkämpfen. Ich danke Ihnen.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mrs. Irina Gerashenko from Ukraine, and she will be followed by Mr. Thomas Portes from France.
Thank you, dear colleague. For Ukraine, security remains a key issue. In this September, Russia launched 1,400 Shahed every day and every night. Along with these missiles, bombs, and guided aerial bombs hit Ukrainian targets daily. These attacks target children's hospitals and energy infrastructure. Now, over 2,800 educational institutions in Ukraine have been damaged. Russia has damaged 530 religion buildings. Now, 1,600 medical facilities have been damaged. According to UNICEF, at least 2,000 children in Ukraine have been killed and wounded over the past 2 years. Now we have 6 million refugees. More than 14,000 Ukrainians are held captive by Russia. All those held in Russian captivity experience systematic torture, and Russian executed Ukrainian prisoners and military men. This is photo, these tortures. We are aware of cases of castration. The Prosecutor General Office has recorded 340 cases of war-related sexual violations, women and men. The age of these victims range from 4 to 82 years old. Russia doesn't understand English, German, or even Russian. It only understands the languages of force, and together we need to speak these languages. There is one path: more weapons to Ukraine, increased sanctions against Russia, and permission to strike legitimate military targets within Russian territories. Russia must be held accountable for all the crimes it has committed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Thomas Portes from France, and he will be followed by Mrs. Özgül Saki from Turkey.
Madame la Présidente, le droit international est en voie d'extinction au profit de la loi du plus fort. Vous avez dit tout à l'heure à la tribune que tout conflit pouvait se régler par l'action politique. Mais où sont les actions politiques pour régler la situation au Liban, à Gaza et en Cisjordanie? Collègues, la situation au Proche-Orient nous oblige. Si nous flanchons sur les principes d'humanité que nous avons nous-mêmes érigés, alors ces principes coulent et les démocraties avec. Le droit international repose sur un socle de règles fondamentales. Si on ne les respecte pas, on ne peut tout simplement pas s'asseoir autour de la même table. Un État ne peut pas, même en temps de guerre, diriger sa force contre des civils, alors même que nous ne sommes ni dans une situation de guerre ni de légitime défense. Plus de 41 000 Palestiniens et Palestiniennes ont été assassinés par l'armée israélienne, dont plus de la moitié sont des femmes et des enfants. Et ce bilan militaire est largement en deçà de ce que disent les experts sur tous les plateaux télé. Au Liban, c'est 1 million de déplacés, c'est 1873 morts depuis le 7 octobre. Un principe doit être ici rappelé, il est fondamental. Les peuples sont souverains et ont droit à l'intégrité territoriale. L'État d'Israël mène un processus de colonisation permanent, avec une accélération inédite depuis 1 an, privant les 6 millions de réfugiés palestiniens de toute perspective de retour. Les Palestiniens sont expulsés de leurs terres par milliers, dépossédés de leurs foyers. Un nettoyage ethnique est en cours. Où sont les voies internationales pour condamner cette colonisation? Où sont les sanctions pour faire appliquer la décision de l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies demandant le retrait de l'ensemble des colonies dans un délai de 12 mois? La paix est fragile. Plus que jamais, nous devons être à la hauteur de l'histoire. Et la responsabilité de l'OSCE est immense. Pour retrouver un chemin de paix, nous avons besoin de faire respecter le droit international, sans double standard. Quelle légitimité pouvons-nous conserver quand nous prenons des sanctions justifiées contre la Russie et laissons Israël massacrer des civils en toute impunité? Je tiens ici à saluer quelques-uns qui ont osé réouvrir le chemin de la paix en se plaçant du côté du droit international, mettant par exemple un terme à leur exportation d'armes à destination d'Israël, comme l'Espagne, les Pays-Bas et le Canada, et évidemment à saluer l'engagement de l'Irlande qui a reconnu l'État de Palestine. Pour terminer, il ne peut y avoir de demi-mesure ni de double standard. Les règles doivent être les mêmes pour tous et toutes. Sans cette boussole, il n'y aura pas de paix possible. Pour s'asseoir à la table de la diplomatie, il faut parler le langage du droit international. Aujourd'hui, Israël parle le langage du crime de guerre et se place au banc des nations. Tant que le génocide à Gaza ne sera pas stoppé, tant que la colonisation n'aura pas pris fin et que les politiques d'apartheid ne seront pas supprimées, il faut rompre les négociations avec l'État israélien pour imposer un cessez-le-feu et sauver des milliers de vies.
Thank you. And now our next speaker is Mrs. Özgül Saki from Turkey, and she will be followed by Mrs. Natalia Pipa from Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, considering the problems discussed and generally focused on in this meeting, it can be said that states of European Union have made effort to address the grievances of one side of the war. But at its core, peacemaking requires a neutrality towards the warring parties and their policies, as well as a commitment to people's human rights and protection of human dignity. For example, one should point to Israel's terrorization of the entire Middle East since its inception, which have reached a new peak with assassination Nasrallah. It should be also underlined that the biggest barrier to the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza is the main policy of Netanyahu. Despite this, Israel's war crimes are hardly ever discussed. Let's give specific example from Turkey that also feed war policies. The European Court of Human Rights ruling on Abdullah Öcalan's right to hope, which were given a few days ago, and on the retrial and release of Selahattin Demirtas, Osman Kavala, and Can Atalay, which were given earlier, haven't been fulfilled. Once again, the European Union's strong response to the non-fulfillment of its own judgment remains unchanged. Silence. So, European Union is becoming less and less credible. For mediation and conciliation policies to be successful, European Union to become a credible organization again and to find effective solutions to problems, it must first of all stand up for own principles and decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mrs. Natalia Pipa from Ukraine, and she will be followed by Mr. Thomas Rödekamp from Germany.
We are all smart people here. And we know very well that when we talk about dialogue and facilitation, it all starts with study. And when we talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war, the main reason why it arose is a better research of Russia's mood and desires. Both the OSCE and many countries of friends and partners don't understand the nature of Russians and all historical Russian states. From the 16th century Principality of Moscow of Ivan the Terrible to Putin's empire. Historians describe Ivan the Terrible as a cruel tyrant and a man with a sick psyche. There are signs of the so-called Russian autocracy. And when we talk about dialogue, the world must understand that it has no deal with a psycho and a sociopath and prepare accordingly. Dialogue that exists in civilized society don't work with the insane. That is why so many countries on the eve of February 24 didn't believe that such a brutal attack was possible, because there are no rational goals for this war, only the goals of a sick psycho. But not Putin alone, but the entire Russian government and 87% of Russians who elect and glorify this government. Therefore, when we talk about a peace agreement, I want to remind you, the Ukraine actually has 4 agreements with Russia today. Year 1991, Russia recognized the inviolability of Ukrainians' borders, including Crimea and Donbass. 1994, Budapest Memorandum. 2014 year occupation of Crimea and Donbass, agreement means one and agreement means two. Summary, Ukraine has 4 peace agreements with Russia that can be flushed down the toilet. The resolution of the global wars, in particular the Second World War, and a change in the attitude of the aggressor is possible, as scientists have proven only under 4 conditions. First, military defeat of aggression that we must do together. Second, military tribunal, denazification and lustration of all Russians. Third, prohibition of propaganda, work with the media and public opinion, freedom of speech, ends where propaganda begins. Propaganda which does not use scientific methods of argumentation and has a twisted, bloody purpose. Fourth, economic growth of the impoverished, manipulated population. For this, the Russian Federation should break up into many countries, and the international community should work with leadership of the new countries. Each of you well knows how it was at school when your classmates fought. Joint defense actions could always stop such conflicts, and together, in cooperation, we will be able to stop aggressor. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Mr. Thomas Röwekamp from Germany, and he will be followed by Mr. Murat Baybatur from Turkey.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, wir alle sind bestürzt und betroffen von dem humanitären Leid, das der verbrecherische Angriffskrieg Russlands in der Ukraine anrichtet, und auch von dem Leid, das die Menschen erfahren nach den terroristischen Angriffen der Hamas, der Hisbollah, der Houthi-Rebellen und letztlich auch des Irans auf Israel. Bei allem menschlichen Leid sind wir als OSZE jedoch auch tief besorgt über das, was wir im Namen führen, nämlich die Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa. Diese Angriffe in der Ukraine und die Angriffe auf Israel sind am Ende auch Angriffe auf die Werte und Vorstellungen, die wir miteinander teilen und nach außen vertreten. Unsere Solidarität gilt in diesem Fall nicht den Regierungen. Wir sind eine Parlamentarierversammlung. Unsere Solidarität gilt den Völkern, dem Volk der Ukraine, aber auch dem Volk Israels. Beide sind Opfer verbrecherischer Angriffe seitens Russlands und seitens Terrororganisationen in Israel. Seit dem Beginn unserer Parlamentarierversammlung, seit dem Prozess von Helsinki, ist Israel unser Kooperationspartner. Israel, das israelische Volk, teilt unsere Werte, unsere Vorstellungen von Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa. Und deswegen ist es wichtig, dass auch wir als Parlamentarierversammlung deutlich unterscheiden, wer in diesen Konflikten Opfer und wer Täter ist. In der Ukraine ist die Frage leicht zu beantworten. Angegriffen hat das verbrecherische Regime von Wladimir Putin. Und deswegen ist es legitim, dass die Ukraine sich gegen diesen Angriffskrieg mit allen Mitteln verteidigt und dazu auch in die Lage versetzt werden muss, russische militärische Infrastruktur anzugreifen. Umgekehrt muss auch den Israelis erlaubt sein, die Angriffsorte, von denen sie und ihr Volk jeden Tag beschossen werden, zu zerstören. Beide Konflikte können schnell beendet sein, wenn die Aggressoren das wollen. Wenn Putin den Krieg beenden will, kann er sich aus der Ukraine zurückziehen. Und wenn der Iran, wenn die Hisbollah, wenn die Hamas und wenn am Ende auch die Houthis den Konflikt und das menschliche Leid beenden wollen, können sie ihre Waffen niederstrecken, ihre militärischen Einrichtungen zerstören und den Weg zu Frieden und Freiheit auch in dieser Region ebnen. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I have only 2 names left on the list, and the next speaker will be Mr. Murat Baybatur from Turkey, and he will be followed by Ms. Tinatin Bokuchava from Georgia.
Sayın Başkan, değerli meslektaşlarım, Agit bölgesinde ve çevresinde çatışmaların ve çatışma potansiyeli taşıyan gerilimlerin yaşandığı bir dönemdeyiz. 3. Dünya Savaşı artık sık sık zikredilmeye başlandı. Agit coğrafyasında Rusya ile Ukrayna arasındaki savaş devam ediyor Hemen yanı başımızda Filistin'de bir yıldır soykırıma varan bir katliam yaşanıyor. İsrail savaşı adım adım Agit sınırlarına taşıyor, bütün bir bölgeyi savaşa sürüklemeye çalışıyor.
Distinguished President, valuable colleagues, we are in a period where conflicts and tensions with the potential for conflict are experienced in and around the OSCE region. Third World War has now begun to be mentioned frequently. The war between Russia and Ukraine continues in the OSCE geography. There is a massacre at the genocidal level right next to us in Palestine that has been going on for a year. Israel is taking the war step by step to the OSCE borders, and they are trying to drag an entire region into war.
Türkiye olarak biz her zaman barışın taraftarı olduk. Tavrımızı hep barıştan yana koyduk. Barışı sağlayacak çözüm önerilerimizi her zaman uluslararası kamuoyuyla paylaştık. Rusya-Ukrayna savaşında her iki ülkeyle temas kurabilen, barışı tesis etmeye çalışan neredeyse tek ülkeyiz. Savaşın daha başında iki ülkeyi İstanbul'da barışa çok yaklaştırmıştık. Tahıl Koridoru Anlaşması'nın hayata geçirilmesini sağladık, esir takaslarına aracılık ettik, diyaloğu ve diplomasiyi her zaman öne koyduk.
As Turkey, we have always been the supporters of peace. We have always taken our stance in favor of peace. We have always shared our solution suggestions to ensure peace with the international public. We are most probably the only country that can establish contact with both countries in the Russia-Ukraine war and try to establish peace. At the very outset of the war, we brought the two countries very close to peace in Istanbul. We ensured the implementation of the Grain Corridor Agreement, we mediated prisoner exchanges, and we have always prioritized dialogue and diplomacy.
Filistin'de garantörlük önerimiz cevapsız kaldı. İsrail diğer arabuluculuk girişimlerinde isteksiz tavrıyla zaman kazanarak kadınları, çocukları, sivilleri katletme peşinde. Biz her yerde elimizden gelen gayreti gösterdik. Göstermeye de devam edeceğiz. Ancak görüyoruz ki maalesef Agit ülkeleri arasında savaşı körükleyen, katliamları meşru göstermeye çalışan ülkeler var. Bu yangınlar büyüdüğünde herkese sıçrayacak.
Our guarantorship proposal in Palestine remained unanswered. Israel is trying to gain time and continue massacring women and children with its reluctant attitude in other mediation attempts. We have done our best everywhere and we will continue to do so. However, we see that unfortunately, there are countries among the OSCE that incite war and try to legitimize these massacres. When these fires grow, they will spread to everyone and everywhere.
Agit paya önemli bir görev düşüyor. Agit payı makul ve adil bir barış için bir diyalog platformu olarak kullanmak mecburiyetindeyiz. En kötü barış, en haklı savaştan daha kutsal ve azizdir. Teşekkür ediyorum.
OSCPA has an important task. We are obliged to use OSCPA as a dialogue platform for a reasonable and fair peace. Let's not forget, the worst peace is better than the most legitimate war. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the next speaker, and at the same time last speaker on our list, is Mrs. Tinatin Bokuchava from Georgia.
I thank you, Madam President. The principles of peace and security underpinning the OSCE are being challenged by Putin every day as he bombs children's hospitals and churches in Ukraine. But what must also not be overlooked are the shameless attempts of other authoritarians, such as Bidzina Ivanishvili governing Georgia, to capitalize on fear of war for the retention of power. Ahead of key parliamentary elections, Ivanishvili's Kremlin-inspired propaganda relies on falsehoods of Russian superiority, cynically suggesting that peace-loving nations of the West seek or perpetuate conflict. Russian-made billionaire Ivanishvili's government, led by the Georgian Dream Party, relies on desperate scare tactics ahead of pivotal elections and openly propagates the territorial dismemberment of Georgia, holding Georgia's most prominent pro-Western politician, former President Mikhail Saakashvili, in captivity on political charges, targeting civil society organizations and cracking down on peaceful protesters with brutal violence. Nevertheless, the Georgian people have made a choice for a European future, for European prosperity, and for European stability. The Georgian dream will not be able to subvert the voice of the Georgian people at the ballot box through distorted constructs of war and peace that are based entirely on Russian propagandistic narratives. I urge all of you, dear colleagues, to join the OSCE election observation mission to Georgia on pivotal elections on October 26th to safeguard Georgia's Euro-Atlantic path, and I thank you for your support to my country's peaceful, prosperous Euro-Atlantic future.
Thank you. And now we only have 1 or 2 minutes left, and I will give the floor to our guest speaker, Mrs. Arguro Kartsonaki, to her response to what you've heard today.
Thank you. I could not even possibly engage with all these comments that I heard, with all these positions. I just wanted to stress that the art of mediation is to find space for engagement, for a diplomatic solution in any conflict, instead of a military victory, to show to the conflict parties what is possible and what is not possible on the battlefield, in any battlefield, be it Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, or Lebanon. And unfortunately, these are not the only battlefields in the world today. So make conflict parties weigh the cost of a continuing war in the pursuit of total victory. These wars can last for decades, have a great humanitarian toll, and devastate the physical space. So does it worth it, having generations living in fear and violence in pursuit of a total military victory? A victory that, even if it comes, it may not be sustainable in the long term and may only plant the seeds for another outbreak of war in 20 years. The French delegate asked, where is political action? You are politicians, and you take the actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kartsonaki. And at the same time, I would like to thank you all for a very enriching discussion. This will close our work today. We will continue tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. with another 2 very interesting sessions dedicated to addressing the climate crisis and to enhancing migration governance in the OSCE. And now I've been told that there is a reception waiting for us, hosted by the head of the Irish delegation, and this reception will be held